From this moment, as far as I'm concerned, you don't exist. Artie, the Sterling family's chauffeur for 30 years, shoved me into the garbage bin. And just before he sealed the lid, he said quietly, "The jacket, there's something inside the lining. Don't lose it." The lid shut. It was completely dark. The smell of rotting food was everywhere. I was alone on top of a pile of trash. There was no one to help me. I was 8 years old. Leo Sterling, the only heir to Sterling Tech. And 4 days later, my face was on the front page of every newspaper in Chicago. Leo Sterling, declared dead. I read it inside a shipping container on the south side of Chicago. Wearing Artie's work jacket. The man who had thrown me into that garbage bin, Artie, our family's driver, was sitting in a jail cell at that very moment, confessing to my murder. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. My uncle Julian, my father's own brother and the man now running Sterling Tech, had no idea that Artie had recorded everything on the security camera that night. The moment Julian slipped into my father's room and tampered with the oxygen machine. Artie had saved that footage onto a USB drive and sewn it into the lining of his jacket. The very jacket I was wearing. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday night. The kind of cold October rain that didn't bother to announce itself, it simply arrived, erasing the edges of everything. The iron gate at the end of the Sterling driveway blurred into the wet dark, and the manicured hedges along the perimeter wall became shapeless, black masses. Lake Forest, Illinois had a way of looking like money even in a storm. The limestone facades, the 3-car garages lit from within like lanterns, the silence that only a certain kind of wealth could purchase. Arthur Miller had learned the rhythms of this silence over 30 years. He sat in the small security booth at the rear service entrance, his coffee mug leaving a ring on the corner of a white envelope he hadn't opened yet. He knew what was inside. He'd known since he pulled it from the mailbox 2 weeks ago and felt the weight of it, the particular, sinking density of a bank's second notice. His name was printed on the front in that impersonal font that financial institutions used to deliver personal catastrophe: Arthur R. Miller. Notice of late payment. The mortgage. 2 months behind, then 3. He'd been telling himself something would work out. He was still telling himself that. He poured the last of his coffee from the thermos, and the cup slipped. The dark liquid spread across the envelope, soaking through it, bleeding into the edge of the paper. He'd been folding and refolding all evening a quarterly 401k statement from Sterling Tech's corporate benefits office, addressed not to him, but retrieved from the recycling bin in the executive hallway by accident, 3 weeks ago, when he'd been breaking down cardboard after a catered dinner. He'd almost thrown it away. Something had made him pause. Some instinct, the same one that had kept him alive and employed through 4 decades of reading powerful people, made him unfold it and look. The numbers didn't add up. They hadn't added up then, and looking at the coffee-stained edges of the printout now, they still didn't. He blotted the paper with the sleeve of his jacket, careful, almost tender. He'd worked for Robert Sterling for 26 of his 30 years on the estate. Robert Sterling, who had been diagnosed with a progressive pulmonary condition 14 months ago. Who had been managing it with supplemental oxygen and a regimen of medications that arrived by courier every Tuesday. Who had by every outward appearance been holding steady. Robert Sterling, who trusted his older brother Julian with power of attorney over the company's employee benefits division because, as Robert had once said to Artie during a long drive to O'Hare, "Julian has always understood the numbers better than I have, Artie. That's the difference between us." Artie had nodded and kept his eyes on the road. He kept his eyes on things. That was his job. That was, in 30 years, the whole of his professional identity: the quiet man in the dark suit. Who held the door, who carried the luggage, who drove the miles, who saw everything and said nothing. The Sterlings treated him the way wealthy families always treat the people who move through their lives. Invisibly, with a particular blend of warmth and forgetfulness. They liked him. They simply never quite remembered he was there. Which was why Julian hadn't checked the hallway before stepping into Robert's room at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The security monitor on Artie's desk showed 6 feeds simultaneously: the front gate, the south garden, the garage bay, the kitchen corridor. the main foyer, and the east wing hallway outside the master suite where Robert slept. The east wing feed was grainy, the camera needing a replacement bulb in its infrared sensor. That Artie had submitted a maintenance request for 6 weeks ago and which had never been addressed. The image was imperfect, but it was sufficient. He watched Julian enter the frame, moving without urgency, the way a man moves when he believes himself to be completely alone. Julian Sterling was 45 years old and had the posture of someone who had never once been told no. He was wearing a dark robe over what appeared to be a dress shirt. He'd been in a late call, probably, or a dinner that ran long. He carried something in his right hand. Small, cylindrical. Artie leaned forward. The monitor showed Julian reaching the oxygen concentrator beside Robert's bed. The machine was visible in the lower corner of the frame, its indicator light a small, steady green. Julian bent over it, his back to the camera, his movements measured and deliberate and quiet. 40 seconds. 50. He straightened, turned, and walked back down the hallway without looking back. The indicator light on the concentrator was no longer green. Artie sat very still. His hands were on the desk. His coffee was getting cold. The mortgage notice sat there, softened at the corners from the spilled liquid, and the 401k statement beside it, and outside the booth window. The rain was still coming down, turning the gravel drive to a shallow river. He became aware of a smell he hadn't noticed before. His own thermos had been refilled from the kitchen earlier. And someone had brewed jasmine tea in the carafe, and the delicate floral scent of it hung in the small enclosed space of the booth. He became aware of something else, too. The weight at the back of the shelf behind him. He'd found it 3 weeks ago, tucked beneath a folded tarp in the maintenance closet. And he'd moved it without thinking, out of reflex, and hadn't thought about what it meant until now. The metallic smell of the loaded gun had been in that booth with him all evening. He exhaled slowly. He was 58 years old. He had a mortgage he couldn't pay, a body that ached in the cold. And 30 years of institutional knowledge about a family that was now going to consider him a liability. Not a person, a liability. A man who had been in that security booth on the night Julian Sterling tampered with his brother's oxygen equipment was not a man the Sterlings could afford to let retire quietly to some condo in Schaumburg. He understood this not as a sudden revelation but as a slow confirmation of something he had been half knowing for weeks. The way you half know a storm is coming before the sky turns that particular color. He took the 401k statement and folded it carefully. He took the mortgage notice and folded that too. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the old work jacket he kept there, dark green canvas, worn at the elbows. The kind of jacket that had spent so many years on his body that it had taken on his shape. He'd been meaning to throw it away for 2 years. He'd never quite gotten around to it. From the same drawer, he retrieved a small sewing kit, needle, thread, a pair of tiny scissors that he kept for minor repairs to his uniform. His hands were not built for fine work. They were a driver's hands, broad and calloused, more comfortable on a steering wheel than a needle. But he worked carefully, slowly, his eyes moving between the jacket lining and the security monitor on the desk. Watching the east wing hallway where Julian had disappeared. He was creating a pocket. Hidden, inside the lining of the jacket, behind the left breast panel, where it would not be felt from the outside. He worked in silence, the rain loud against the booth roof, the jasmine tea going cold at his elbow. He did not think about what came next. There was no point in thinking about what came next when you didn't yet know what you had. What he had was a grainy camera image he couldn't prove, a financial document. He wasn't supposed to have, and 30 years of watching powerful people make choices that they believed had no consequences. He had a mortgage he couldn't pay and a loaded gun on a shelf behind him and a sick man asleep down a hallway whose oxygen machine had just gone dark. He threaded the needle again. The stitching was uneven but it would hold. "Artie, is the car ready?" Julian's voice came through the intercom at 12:22, flat and unhurried. Artie pressed the response button. 10 minutes, Mr. Sterling, he said. His voice was steady. 30 years of steadiness. I'll bring it around. He folded the statements into the hidden pocket, smoothed the lining closed, and set the jacket on the shelf beside the gun. Then he stood, straightened his uniform jacket, and walked out into the rain to bring the car around. His hands did not shake. He would not allow them to. The landfill opened at the south end of the city, where the streets stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were: industrial, functional, indifferent to human comfort. The access road was unpaved past the second gate, and the Sterling family's discreet waste contractor had been running the Tuesday overnight route for 11 years without incident. The driver didn't ask questions. He loaded, he drove, he dumped. 4 in the morning was a good time to move things without being seen, which was why it had been chosen, and why the south side of the landfill smelled the way it did in the hours before dawn. Not simply of garbage, but of everything that people had decided to stop acknowledging. Leo Sterling had been inside the sealed cargo bin for 47 minutes before the bottom dropped out. He came to awareness slowly, the way children do when they've been deeply asleep and the world reassembles itself in the wrong order. First there was the smell, overwhelmingly, comprehensively, the smell of food in various stages of decomposition. Wet cardboard, and something sour and fermented underneath that he would later understand was 3 days of restaurant waste from the Sterling kitchen. Then there was cold, not the manageable cold of an air-conditioned room or even a winter morning, but the cold that comes from being surrounded by wet mass, damp on all sides. The kind of cold that finds its way inside clothing and stays there. He was wearing his pajamas. The blue silk ones with the small racing cars printed on the fabric, the ones his father had sent from a business trip to London 2 Christmases ago. They were soaked through. He was lying on his side on a compressed layer of black garbage bags, and to his left was a wall of rotting lettuce. Its leaves gone translucent and brown, collapsing into themselves. Leo sat up. He was 8 years old and had spent 8 years in rooms where the surfaces were clean. And the temperature was controlled and the food appeared on schedule and the people around him were paid to ensure his comfort. His frame of reference for hardship was a delayed breakfast or a Wi-Fi outage. He sat in the dark in the landfill and tried to locate his bearings using the tools available to him, which were minimal. There was a faint gray light coming from somewhere above and to the right, the beginning of the landfill's ambient lighting along the access road, some distance away. It was enough to see shapes but not details. He could make out the silhouette of the cargo bin's dropped gate behind him and the vast, uneven terrain of the dump stretching outward in every direction. The sound of the truck was gone. He'd heard it. He'd been conscious enough to hear the engine, the hydraulic groan of the bin tilting, the brief and terrifying moment of freefall, and then nothing. Just the distant wail of a police cruiser moving along some parallel street, its siren not slowing, not approaching. Moving on. He put his hands into the debris around him, instinctively, and his right palm came down on something sticky. He pulled back, and in the weak light he could see the dark residue of what had been a can of soda cola, by the smell. That had been crushed and emptied days ago. The stickiness coated his fingers and didn't come off when he wiped them on the wet cardboard beside him. His pajama pants had gone from soaked to clammy, the silk heavy and cold against his legs. He began to cry, and then stopped himself, not because he was trying to be brave, but because crying made his chest hurt and his breathing go wrong, and the smell became worse when he opened his mouth. He reached into the garbage around him with more purpose, pushing aside a collapsed cereal box. A nest of used paper towels, the deflated plastic of what had once been a gallon of milk. His hands found the edge of something solid, the canvas of a jacket. He recognized it immediately, not from sight but from texture, from the worn, smooth feel of the collar, from the way it resisted slightly before coming free of the debris. Artie's old work jacket, the green one, the one that Artie always said he was going to throw away and never did. Leo pulled it out. It was heavy for a jacket. He noticed that immediately the weight wasn't right. He ran his hands over the front of it in the dark, and his fingers found the breast panel and something beneath it. A slight irregularity in the lining, a stiffness that shouldn't have been there. He pressed at it. There was something inside, flat, folded, paper. He found the edge of the hidden pocket. The stitching was rough, not like the rest of the jacket. And he worked his small fingers into it until he felt two things come free. Paper, folded paper, damp at the edges. And something else, small, thin, rectangular, smooth plastic casing. He brought it close to his face in the dim light. A Medicare card, the kind his grandmother used to keep in her wallet, white, with blue text, a name and number printed on it. Arthur R. Miller. He held the card in one hand and the jacket in the other. And he understood nothing except that Artie had put these things here deliberately, and that wherever here was, Artie was not in it. The truck's engine roared again in the distance, a different truck now, moving along the main access road, headlights sweeping the near side of the dump. Leo pressed himself flat, an animal instinct he hadn't known he possessed, and the lights swept past without stopping. When the dark came back, he sat up and put Artie's jacket on over his wet pajamas. It came past his knees. The shoulders hung off him by half a foot on each side. He had to roll the sleeves 4 times to find his hands. He must have looked, in that moment, like a child wearing a costume which was, in its way, exactly what he was. He fastened the buttons with unsteady fingers and pulled the collar up around his ears. The smell of the jacket was engine grease, old coffee, and something warmer underneath, something that Leo could not have named. But that registered in his body as familiar and safe. He pressed his face into the collar for a moment, eyes closed. Then he started walking. He moved toward the gray light at the edge of the landfill, his feet going through soft debris with each step, his silk pajama pants visible below the hem of the jacket. His face set in the particular expression of a child who has run out of better options. He didn't scream again. His throat still tasted like copper from the first time, sharp and metallic at the back of his palate, and he understood already that screaming had done nothing. He needed to find a person. Specifically, he needed to find a person who was not affiliated with his uncle Julian, and in the south side of Chicago at 4 in the morning, the taxonomy of available persons was limited. He found Martha Higgins at 20 past 4, or rather, she found him. She appeared between 2 hills of compressed scrap at the far edge of the accessible zone. Her cart preceding her, a repurposed shopping cart with one fixed wheel and a bungee cord holding a plastic bin to its frame. She was 72 years old and had the build of someone who had spent decades doing physical work, compact and deliberate in her movements. She wore a headlamp strapped over a wool hat, and its beam caught Leo full in the face before she could redirect it. She stopped. He stopped. "Lord," she said, not as an exclamation, as a statement of fact, the specific, quiet invocation of a woman who had seen enough of the world that encountering a small boy in a man's jacket at a municipal landfill before sunrise registered as theology rather than surprise. "My name is Leo," he said. "I need help." She looked at him for a long moment. Her headlamp picked out the details, the wet silk pajama hems below the oversized jacket, the soda-sticky hands, the expression on his face that was trying very hard not to be the expression it was. "You're cold," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She reached into her cart without ceremony and produced a folded emergency blanket, the thin metallic kind, crinkled from previous use, and held it out to him. Leo took it and wrapped it around his shoulders over the jacket. The crinkling sound it made was enormous in the pre-dawn quiet of the landfill. "You got anyone?" she asked. He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He thought about Artie, who was not here. He thought about his father, who was in the hospital. Whose oxygen machine? Don't think about that. Don't think about that. Whose condition was being managed. He thought about his uncle Julian, whose face on the security camera feed he had glimpsed once from the backseat of the car. Turned away, talking quietly on his phone in a tone Leo associated with adult conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. "No," Leo said. Martha nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already calculated. She reached back into her cart and produced a Snickers bar slightly bent, still in its wrapper, and handed it to him with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had learned that survival questions got answered in order of urgency, and that the order was always the same. First warmth, second food, third everything else. "Eat that," she said. "Then you can walk with me." Leo ate the Snickers bar in 4 bites, standing in the landfill in the dark, wearing a dead man's jacket over ruined silk pajamas, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. His throat still hurt. The sticky soda residue was still on his hands. The emergency blanket crinkled with every breath. He walked with Martha. The free clinic on South Halsted operated out of a converted storefront between a check cashing outlet and a laundromat, and it had been serving the neighborhood's uninsured and underinsured population for 11 years through a combination of volunteer physicians, grant funding that renewed annually on a prayer, and the particular institutional stubbornness of its founding director, who had grown up 4 blocks away and returned after medical school because that was the kind of decision certain people made when they had options and chose not to use them selfishly. None of this was visible from the waiting room. What was visible from the waiting room was linoleum the color of old mustard, 43 plastic chairs in various states of structural integrity, a wall-mounted television showing a local morning news broadcast with the sound turned low, and a reception desk behind a sheet of scuffed plexiglass at which a woman in her early 40s sat with the focused energy of someone who had decided that efficiency was the only acceptable response to an impossible workload. Martha pushed through the front door at 8:53 in the morning, Leo behind her, and the waiting room assessed them both in the practiced, unconscious way that waiting rooms always do. The man in the corner with the bandaged hand glanced up and away. The young mother with the toddler on her lap registered Martha's cart and Leo's jacket and returned her attention to her phone. The fluorescent lights hummed. Leo's knee had opened up sometime during their walk from the landfill. A bad scrape along the right kneecap from when he'd caught his foot in a coil of old wire and gone down hard on the gravel path. It wasn't serious, but it was bleeding steadily through the tear in his pajama leg, and Martha had declared, with the authority of a woman not given to unnecessary medical escalation, that it needed cleaning and bandaging, and that was that. She approached the reception desk and produced her Medicare card from the front pocket of her coat, not the same pocket as her money, Leo had noticed. Always separate. Clinic services for my grandson, Martha said. The receptionist looked at the card through the plexiglass, then looked at the two of them, the 72-year-old black woman in her worn coat, the small boy in an adult's jacket with blood on his knee, and what appeared to be the hem of silk pajamas visible above a pair of borrowed rubber boots 3 sizes too large. Relationship documentation, the receptionist said. He's my grandson, Martha said. I need documentation of guardianship for a minor receiving clinic services. Insurance card, Medicaid number, or proof of guardianship. I have my Medicare card right there. That's your insurance, ma'am. For your coverage, a child requires. He needs his knee cleaned, Martha said. It's bleeding. The receptionist looked at the explanation of benefits form that Martha had now placed on the counter, her EOB statement from last quarter. The one she carried because it was the only official document she had that listed her address and her name in print from a government-affiliated source, and which she had learned, over years of navigating these systems, sometimes worked when nothing else did. The receptionist looked at it with the expression of someone recognizing a tactic they had seen before. Ma'am, I understand, but without proof of guardianship or the child's own insurance information, I'm not able to register him as a patient. His knee is bleeding, Martha said again, more quietly. The quieter she got, Leo had already learned in their brief time together, the more serious she was. There's a pediatric ER at Rush Medical. We don't have transportation to Rush Medical. Ma'am, we don't have transportation. A security guard materialized from somewhere to the left of the desk, a large man in a gray uniform shirt, who had clearly spent years developing the particular posture of someone whose job was to make people feel that their presence was tolerated on sufferance. He positioned himself at Martha's left elbow without making direct contact, the spatial language of institutional authority that said, "You are about to be moved whether you choose to move or not." "We don't serve street rats without insurance," the receptionist said. And her voice had dropped, pitched now for the space between herself and Martha only, the particular private cruelty that bureaucratic positions sometimes enabled, the small, deniable cruelties of people who had learned that no one who mattered was listening. Martha stood very straight. Leo stood beside her, and he was aware of something moving through him that he couldn't have named, not quite anger, because anger required a framework, and his framework for this kind of treatment was non-existent. He had been, for 8 years, a child whose knee would have been attended to immediately. A child whose comfort was managed. He had been, for the last 8 hours, a child sleeping under garbage. The distance between those two states was so vast that he hadn't yet found the emotional language for it, and what filled the space instead was something cold and observational. The part of his brain that simply registered this is what the world looks like from here. The security guard moved slightly, and Martha's hand found Leo's shoulder, not pushing him back, just contact, steady. And then Leo looked at the television. The morning news was running a segment that had clearly been cycling since the early broadcast. A banner across the bottom of the screen read "Missing Heir Leo Sterling, 8. Family offers $500,000 reward." And above the banner, filling half the screen, was a photograph of Leo taken at last. Year's Sterling Tech Foundation dinner, his hair combed, wearing a small blue blazer, smiling at the camera with the confident ease of a child who had never had reason not to. On screen now, live, was his uncle Julian. Julian Sterling stood at a podium outside what appeared to be the Sterling Tech corporate headquarters, microphones clustered in front of him. And his face was arranged in an expression that Leo could only now, seeing it from the outside, identify accurately. It was the performance of grief. The jaw set just so. The eyes slightly reddened. Leo could not tell from this distance if they were actually wet. Julian's voice was inaudible beneath the clinic's ambient noise, but the chyron below was sufficient. Julian Sterling appeals for son's safe return. Son. Julian had called him son on television. Leo watched his uncle's hands move as he spoke to the assembled press, gesturing, open-palmed, the body language of sincerity. And then Julian shifted his weight, and in the movement his robe, his suit jacket, fell open slightly. And his right wrist came up, and the studio lights caught the face of his watch. Diamond-encrusted bezel, dark dial, a specific, distinctive watch that Leo had seen once before, in the Sterling garage, on a night when Julian had been standing in the service corridor outside his father's wing, speaking quietly into his phone in a tone that stopped when he noticed Leo in the hallway. "Leo, bedtime," Julian had said, and smiled, and his wrist had turned the watch face inward. Leo looked at the television screen. He looked at the watch on Julian's wrist, visible for 3-4 seconds before Julian turned slightly and it disappeared. He looked at the plexiglass window and the receptionist behind it and the security guard at Martha's elbow. He said nothing. He had Artie's Medicare card in the jacket pocket. He had 2 folded papers whose contents he had not yet been able to read in sufficient light. He had a bleeding knee in silk pajama hems and borrowed rubber boots. He had been declared, somewhere in the machinery of the world, already dead or as good as. He had been, for the last 8 hours, a boy who smelled like yesterday's garbage, and the receptionist's words were still hanging in the air of the waiting room. Like something that had been said because it was true, because at this particular window in this particular building. It was simply, factually, operationally true. The guard put his hand on Martha's arm. "Let's go, ma'am." Martha looked at Leo. Leo looked at Martha. Some communication passed between them that required no words. The shorthand of people who had, in the space of a single morning, arrived at a mutual understanding about their respective situations and what those situations required. Martha picked up her Medicare card from the counter. She put it in her pocket, the document pocket, not the money pocket. She straightened her coat. "Come on, baby," she said. They walked back out through the clinic doors into the gray October morning. Leo's knee still bleeding, the emergency blanket gone, Artie's jacket reaching past his knees. The security guard watched them go from inside the glass door and then turned back to his post. On the television behind him, Julian Sterling was still speaking. His hands were open. His face was arranged in grief. His watch had disappeared back inside his cuff. Martha stopped on the sidewalk and tore a clean strip from the paper bag she used to line her cart. And she folded it and pressed it firmly against Leo's knee and told him to hold it there, which he did, without complaint. "You know that man?" she asked, gesturing toward the clinic window where the television was still visible, still showing Julian's face. Leo looked back at the screen. "Yes," he said. "He looking for you?" A pause. "He thinks he is," Leo said. Martha looked at him for a long moment, the headlamp no longer on, her face in the flat daylight, showing the specific topology of 72 years of navigating systems that were not designed with her in mind. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "We find somewhere else." The shipping container sat at the back of a half-acre lot off South Racine, behind a shuttered auto parts supplier. whose chain link fence had been compromised in 3 places over a decade of neighborhood attrition. Martha knew the lot. She knew most of the functional shelter along the south routes she walked, which doorways stayed dry, which dumpster enclosures blocked the wind from the north, which structures had enough residual warmth to make a difference on a night below 40 degrees. The container was 10 feet by 10 feet of corrugated steel, its original orange paint oxidized to a rust-streaked brown, its doors secured with a padlock whose combination Martha had been given 2 years ago by a man named Deakins who no longer needed it. She spun the lock from memory. Inside a folded moving blanket, 2-gallon jugs of water, an electric lantern with a failing battery, a milk crate serving as a table. On the crate, a plastic bag containing a pill organizer 7-day. The kind with the flip lids, each compartment labeled in Martha's handwriting in blue marker. She lit the lantern. It gave off a weak, amber light that was nonetheless sufficient after the gray daylight outside. "Sit," she told Leo, and he sat on the folded blanket, and she knelt slowly, her knees announcing themselves, and cleaned his wound with water from one of the jugs on the corner of a clean cloth she kept in her coat pocket with the efficiency of someone who had learned first aid from necessity rather than coursework. Leo sat still and let her work. The container's steel walls were thin and the wind found the seams. Every few minutes the whole structure shuddered slightly as the elevated train passed on the nearby tracks overhead, the vibration traveling up through the floor and into Leo's legs, a low mechanical tremor that came and went on a schedule he began to recognize after the 3rd time. Between the trains, there was the sound of the wind, and the distant intermittent noise of the city, and the small sounds of Martha tearing medical tape with her teeth. "There," she said. Leo looked at his knee. The bandaging was neat. Martha had done this before. She settled herself onto the milk crate with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned to protect her joints. And she opened the plastic bag and took out her pill organizer and counted the contents with a brief, practiced motion. She did not comment on what she counted or didn't count, but Leo saw her jaw set slightly, and then release. He had been watching the lantern die by degrees for the last 20 minutes when Martha produced a folded newspaper from the lining of her cart. She used newspapers for insulation, he'd discovered, tucked flat against the interior walls of the cart and refreshed when she found new ones. This one was 2 days old, retrieved from a recycling bin on Halsted, and she'd unfolded it to add to the cart's base layer before stopping. She looked at the front page. Then she looked at Leo. She held it out to him. Leo took the paper. The photograph on the front page was not the foundation dinner photo they'd used on the television broadcast. This was older, a candid shot from some outdoor Sterling event. Leo, perhaps 6 years old, standing beside his father with his hand in his father's hand. His father was looking at the camera. Leo was looking at something off to the left, distracted by something beyond the frame. Leo Sterling declared dead. The subheading: Chauffeur Arthur Miller confesses to kidnapping, body not found, family prepares memorial. Leo read the headline 3 times. He read the subheading. He read the first paragraph of the story, which described Artie as a disgraced former employee of the Sterling estate, who had confessed to abducting the minor child, and whose criminal history and financial instability suggest the possibility of ransom motivation, though no demands were received. He read the paragraph about Julian, now identified as Sterling Tech CEO and acting legal guardian of the Sterling estate pending probate proceedings, who had issued a statement through counsel expressing the family's profound grief and requesting privacy during the process of accepting the likelihood that Leo is no longer with us. Accepting the likelihood. Leo set the newspaper down on the floor of the container and looked at the space between his feet. His face, 8 years old and reading this with full comprehension, did the thing that children's faces sometimes do in moments of genuine extremity. It went still. Not calm. Stillness was not calm. It was the suspension of the ordinary processing of emotion when the emotional input exceeded the available processing capacity. He had read his own obituary in a recycled newspaper in a shipping container on South Racine. And his brain was simply, quietly, incapable of moving fast enough to catch up to that fact. The EL train passed. The container shuddered. The lantern flickered. The vibration traveled up through the floor, through the moving blanket, into the base of Leo's spine, and faded. He reached into the pocket of Artie's jacket and took out the pill organizer he'd moved there from the crate earlier, turning it over in his hands. Martha's name wasn't on it, she'd told him, in the sparse biography she'd offered during their walk, that she'd been using the container as an emergency overnight site. Since her eviction notice had arrived from the assisted living facility on East Pershing, which had tripled its rates 18 months ago and which now wanted the remainder of her adjusted monthly fee paid in arrears before it would consider reinstating her residency. The medical debt was from a hospitalization 2 summers ago. The notice had come from a collection agency. The assisted living facility had, in its letter, used the phrase financial noncompliance to describe Martha's situation, which Martha had read to Leo with a tone of dry, measured contempt that had made him, briefly, admire her. The pill organizer had 6 of the 7 days filled. He looked at the empty Sunday compartment and the partial Monday compartment. He looked at the folded newspaper on the container floor with his own face on the front page. He was declared dead. Artie had confessed. Julian was preparing a memorial and consolidating the estate. No one is looking for a boy who is already a ghost. The thought arrived with a finality that was almost physical, a weight settling across his shoulders that had nothing to do with the jacket. He was 8 years old and officially non-existent, and the person responsible for him was in a jail cell somewhere. Having confessed to his disappearance, and his uncle was on television with red-rimmed eyes and an open-faced gesture and a diamond watch pressing against the inside of his cuff. Martha watched him from the milk crate. She didn't speak. She had the quality unusual in Leo's experience, which had been populated largely by adults who felt compelled to fill children's silences, of being able to simply be present in a moment without demanding anything from it. After a long time, Leo said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. If you had something," he said carefully, choosing the words the way Artie had once taught him to choose a route, always no 2 exits. "Leo, always, if you had something that could prove something that someone very powerful didn't want proved. What would you do with it?" Martha looked at him. "How old are you?" she asked. 8. She considered this. "I'd find someone who had less to lose than me and more to gain than the powerful person. Those people exist. They're just usually not easy to find." Leo put his hand into the jacket's hidden pocket. The folded papers were still there, still damp at the edges. He had not read them in sufficient light yet. And beneath the papers, his fingers found something he hadn't noticed before, small, smooth, tucked flat against the pocket's inner seam. A USB drive. Black plastic, no larger than his thumb. He took it out and held it in the amber lamplight. It was the color of the underside of a car, matte black, functional, deliberately unremarkable. The kind of thing designed to go unnoticed until it was needed. Truth is messy, Leo. And it's always at the bottom. He closed his hand around the drive. The EL train passed again. The container shuddered around them, the steel groaning softly at its joints, the lantern dipping and steadying. Martha counted her pills again with the patient precision of a woman managing limited resources with maximum care. Wind moved through the seams. Leo looked at the newspaper one more time, his own face, distracted by something outside the frame of the photograph. Looking at something the camera hadn't caught, and then he turned it face down on the container floor. He was 8 years old. He was officially dead. He had Artie's jacket, Artie's Medicare card, 2 folded documents, and a USB drive that Artie had hidden in the lining of a jacket that had been, until last night, simply the old jacket he kept meaning to throw away. Artie had not thrown it away. Artie had not thrown it away, and there was a reason for that, and the reason was in Leo's hand. He did not know yet what was on the drive, but he knew one thing with the clarity of a child who has had something explained to him by a man he trusted completely. Artie Miller did not do anything without a reason. And he did not hide anything without intending it to be found. Found by the right person. In the right place. At the right time. Friends, what a journey so far. Arthur Miller spent 30 years being invisible so the Sterlings could be powerful, and the moment he finally saw something he couldn't unsee, he made a choice that cost him everything. Now he's in a jail cell confessing to a crime he committed out of love. And Leo, 8 years old, declared dead by the morning news, is sitting in a shipping container on the south side of Chicago. holding a USB drive that could bring down an empire. Julian Sterling thinks he's won. He's got the company, the estate, the memorial, the tears on camera. He's got everything. But here's what Julian doesn't know yet: the jacket is still out there. Stay with us. The truth is about to start climbing. The memory came back to him sideways, the way memories do when the body is cold. And the mind has run out of present tense problems to solve and reaches, without permission, into the past. He was 3 years younger in it. 5 years ago, which for an 8-year-old is more than half a life. The Sterling garage in summer, the big doors rolled open to the afternoon heat, the smell of motor oil and clean concrete, and the specific warm metal smell that garages had that Leo had always liked without knowing why. Artie was teaching him to check the oil. Come here. No, get closer. You need to be able to see it. The dipstick was longer than Leo expected, slender and marked with 2 lines near its tip. Artie had pulled it free, wiped it on a folded cloth, and reinserted it with the patience he brought to everything mechanical, total, unhurried. The patience of a man who had learned that machines rewarded precision and punished assumptions. Read it, Artie said. Leo squinted at the markings. It's between the lines. That's fine. Between the lines is fine. What you're checking for isn't just level. You're checking color, consistency. Here, Artie ran his thumb along the dipstick's coated tip. See how it comes off? That's clean. That's good. Now, the gauge on the dashboard might tell you you're fine. Don't believe the gauge. The gauge is what the system wants you to see. The dipstick is what's actually happening. Why would the gauge lie? Artie wiped the dipstick with the cloth and slid it back into the engine housing. It doesn't lie on purpose. But it measures from a distance. Anything that measures from a distance is going to miss something. He had said, after a moment, never trust the gauge, Leo. Always check the dipstick yourself. Truth is messy, and it's always at the bottom. Leo hadn't known what he meant at the time. He had filed it, the way children file adult statements that seem to mean more than their surface alongside other Artie-isms. Pieces of practical philosophy delivered over grease-stained cloths and the sound of engines. He had thought, later, that it was simply Artie's way of teaching car maintenance. Now, in the container on South Racine with the amber lamp fading and Martha asleep on the moving blanket, Leo turned the USB drive over in his hands and understood. Put it where they'd never think to look. In the grease. In the jacket. In the trash. Artie had not kidnapped him. Artie had hidden him. The distinction was everything. It reorganized the last 18 hours into a shape that made sense, not comfortable sense, not safe sense, but coherent sense, the kind of sense that a person could work with. Artie had watched Julian on the security feed. Artie had understood, with 30 years of watching powerful people make consequential choices, what Julian would do next. And Artie had understood something else: that a witness was only a liability if the people who wanted him silenced could find him. Julian would never look in the trash. Leo held the drive up in the fading lamplight. He thought about the 401k statement, which he hadn't yet read in full. He thought about the security camera footage that Artie must have recorded. That's what was on the drive. It had to be. It was the only thing that made the whole construction of what Artie had done cohere. The hidden pocket, the jacket, the documents, the drive. Artie had built a case. Alone, at a desk in a security booth at midnight, with unsteady hands and a sewing kit not designed for his fingers. Artie had assembled the only protection available to him: evidence, hidden in the one place that a wealthy man's instincts would prevent him from searching. The grease on the jacket wasn't dirt. It was Artie's promise. Leo pressed the jacket's collar against his chin and sat very still in the container while Martha breathed steadily on the blanket. Her pill organizer on the crate beside her, her cart's bungee cord looped over the door handle. The EL train came and went. The lamp flickered once, twice, and stabilized. He had not been discarded. He had been hidden, and now he needed to find someone with a computer, a secure location, and the specific combination of technical capability and motivated self-interest that Martha had described: less to lose than him, more to gain than Julian. He knew, without fully knowing how he knew, exactly who that person was. He'd ridden past Rossi's scrapyard on East 130th a dozen times in the back of Artie's car. He'd watched Artie's hand lift off the steering wheel once barely, just the index finger raised as they passed the entrance. The small acknowledgement between men who shared something that didn't need naming in front of passengers. Leo had asked, once, who owned it. Old friend, Artie had said. Good man. Leo tucked the USB drive back into the hidden pocket. He lay down on the edge of the moving blanket, careful not to disturb Martha, and pulled the jacket tight around himself. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow they would go to the scrapyard. It took them most of the morning to walk to East 130th. Martha did not complain about this. She adjusted her cart's bungee cord at the start, set her pace, and moved through the south side streets with the navigational confidence of someone who had been walking these routes for years. And knew which blocks required attention and which could be moved through without incident. Leo kept pace beside her, his rubber boots still 3 sizes too large, his hands in the jacket pockets. He had told her, in the container before dawn, where they were going and as much of why as he could explain. Martha had listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had said, "You know this person can be trusted?" Artie trusted him. She had nodded, with the specific quality of nodding that meant that's not a guarantee, but it's the best available criterion, and we'll proceed on it. Rossi's scrapyard announced itself from 2 blocks away. With the smell of oxidized metal and the sound of something large being compressed somewhere within the property. The entrance was a chain-link gate set in a corrugated metal fence. The kind of fence that communicated, without hostility, that the interior was not public space. A hand-painted sign read Rossi Auto Salvage All Sales Final No Trespassing. Below this, in smaller letters, cash only. No exceptions. Don't ask. Martha put her hand on the gate. Let me, Leo said. He stepped up to the intercom panel mounted on the fence post. A battered box with a single button and a speaker grill so old that its mesh had partially separated from its frame. He pressed the button and waited. Static. Then a voice, flat and cautious, "We're closed." "My name is Leo," Leo said. "Artie Miller sent me." A very long pause. "Artie Miller's in Cook County Jail," the voice said. "I know," Leo said. "That's why I'm here." Another pause. Longer. The compression sound somewhere in the yard stopped, and the quiet it left behind had a listening quality to it. The specific silence of a space where someone was deciding something. The gate buzzed and swung inward. Michael Rossi was 55 years old, built like someone who had spent decades moving heavy things and had subsequently become heavy himself in the particular way that physical work produces not soft weight but layered, structural weight. The kind that settled into shoulders and forearms and the set of the jaw. He had a gray beard cut close and eyes that assessed continuously, automatically. The habit of a man who had learned early that the world sorted itself into categories and the sorting happened fast. He looked at Leo. He looked at Martha. He looked at the jacket. Something moved across his face recognition, complicated by something Leo couldn't name, something that looked like grief. Held sideways, held at a managed distance. "Come in," he said. The yard's interior was more organized than its exterior suggested. Vehicles in various states of disassembly were arranged in rows, cars stripped to their frames, others intact but clearly non-functional. A section near the back fence dedicated to parts. Sorted into labeled bins with the systematic logic of someone who ran their operation with precision under its deliberate surface chaos. An office trailer sat at the yard's center, its windows lit, its door open. Rossi led them inside. The office was small and warm, smelling of coffee and printer ink. A desk covered in folders, a bank of monitors showing security feeds of the yard's perimeter, a space heater running under the desk. On one wall, a pegboard hung with keys on labeled hooks, each hook tagged with a handwritten number. On the opposite wall, a photograph Artie Miller, maybe 15 years younger. Standing beside a younger Rossi at what appeared to be a car show, both men squinting against summer sun. Rossi saw Leo looking at the photograph. 20 years ago, he said. "Your boy's got his eye." "His eye?" Leo asked. "The way he looked at things. Like he was reading them." Rossi sat down across from them, his chair protesting under his weight. "Artie pulled me out of something I had no business being in, about 22 years ago. I told him I owed him. He told me debt was bad for friendships. We argued about that for 20 years. He looked at his hands. He never collected. Leo reached into the hidden pocket of the jacket and produced the USB drive. He set it on the desk between them. Rossi looked at it. He looked at Leo. He picked it up, turned it over, examined the casing. You know what's on it? I think it's video, Leo said. From the security camera at the Sterling estate. The East Wing. Tuesday night. Rossi was quiet for a moment. Tuesday night, he repeated. The night Artie took you. The night Artie hid me, Leo said. Rossi looked at him steadily, and something recalibrated in the assessment behind his eyes. Not surprise. Exactly, but recalibration. He opened a drawer, removed a laptop, connected the drive. The encryption prompt appeared immediately. Rossi leaned back. It's locked. Can you open it? Depends on what kind of lock. He turned to a second monitor, pulled up a program Leo didn't recognize, and began working. His hands moved over the keyboard with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned certain skills in contexts that had never been officially documented. He didn't explain what he was doing, and Leo didn't ask. Martha, beside Leo, had accepted a cup of coffee from the small machine on the office's back counter and was drinking it with her eyes on the security feeds. She was watching the perimeter monitors with the same calm, practical attention she brought to her cart route. Not alarmed, simply informed. It took Rossi 40 minutes. When the drive opened, there was one folder. Inside the folder, 2 files. A video file and a document. Rossi opened the video. The East Wing hallway of the Sterling estate appeared on screen, grainy and infrared lit. Timestamp reading 11:47 p.m. Julian Sterling entered the frame. His robe, his deliberate movements, his 47 seconds at the oxygen concentrator. The indicator light going from green to dark. Julian straightening, turning, walking back down the hallway without looking back. The three of them sat and watched it in silence. Leo's fear, the cold, ambient, body-wide fear that had been his companion since the landfill, did not disappear. But it changed. It shifted from formless to directional, the way water shifts when a channel appears. He felt it move from his chest into something harder and lower, something that pressed outward rather than inward. Mike, he said. Rossi stopped the playback. I need a suit, Leo said. The cheapest, darkest one you have. Rossi looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Martha, who was looking at her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who had seen children decide things before. And knew better than to intervene when the decision was correct. He looked back at Leo. I have something in the back, he said. But first, the phone call. Rossi produced a burner phone from the desk drawer still. In its packaging, a prepaid model he'd bought months ago for reasons he'd never had occasion to use it for. Leo took it, peeled off the packaging, and held it. He was thinking about the document, the second file on the drive. He'd scanned it while Rossi was working on the encryption. It was a personnel file from Sterling Tech's HR division, old, and buried in it was a code, not a secret code, not an elaborate cipher, but a simple internal identifier. An employee access code that his grandfather had set up years ago as an emergency contact protocol. And which Artie had documented and saved because Artie documented and saved things that mattered and kept them somewhere safe. The Sterling Tech HR director's direct line was in the document. Leo dialed. It rang twice. Sterling Tech Human Resources, Director's Office. This is Leo Sterling, Leo said. Authentication code November Sierra 14 Gold. Silence on the line. The long, specific silence of someone who has just processed something they were not prepared to process. Leo, the voice dropped. Leo, we were told. I know what you were told, Leo said. I need 48 hours and a guarantee of confidentiality. After that, I need you to arrange access to the Cook County Courthouse on Friday morning. One seat at the sentencing hearing. Can you do that? Another silence. Yes, the HR director said. Quietly, yes, I can do that. Leo ended the call. He set the burner phone on the desk. He looked at the frozen frame on Rossi's monitor. Julian in the hallway, back to the camera. 47 seconds of deliberate action captured in grainy infrared. The fear in his chest had finished its transformation. Okay, he said. The suit. Cook County Courthouse on a Friday morning had the particular energy of a place where large, irreversible things happened on a schedule. The stone exterior was the color of old authority-worn limestone gray, steps broad and shallow, the kind of architecture designed to make the people ascending it feel the weight of what happened inside. The morning was cold. An overnight frost had left a thin film on the steps that the building staff had salted but not entirely cleared. And the people arriving for the day's hearings picked their way up with the careful footsteps of those who were already managing enough without adding a fall. Inside, the security line moved slowly. A court officer ran a wand over a man in a windbreaker. Two lawyers in matching dark coats talked to each other without looking up from their phones. A woman with a binder under her arm waited with the patience of someone on their fourth appearance in this building this week. Courtroom 14 was assigned to the morning's sentencing hearing, State of Illinois vs. Arthur R. Miller, docket No. 2025 CR 4471. The gallery filled by 8:45. Julian Sterling arrived at 8:52 and took his seat in the front row. He was dressed precisely a charcoal suit of the kind that communicated expense without announcing it. A dark tie, cufflinks that caught the fluorescent light of the courtroom. He held his phone in his left hand, and in the casual, unconscious way of a man who had spent decades in rooms where he was the most powerful person present, he glanced at it occasionally. A notification, a brief scan. He was managing the morning as he managed all mornings, as a series of administrative tasks, each with its expected outcome. Today's expected outcome: the sentencing of Arthur Miller, confessed kidnapper, to a term of years. That would effectively constitute the remainder of the man's functional life. The erasure, institutional and permanent, of the one person who had been in that hallway at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and had the ill fortune and the worse judgment of being conscious enough to register what he'd seen. Julian had done the calculations. He had done them carefully, the way he calculated all things. Artie's mortgage, his retirement situation, his confession, which had been obtained by Julian's attorneys, with a speed and specificity that had required a certain amount of implied pressure, and a document with a particular shape. Artie was old. Artie was broke. Artie was alone. These were not cruelties, they were facts. The system processed facts. Julian had simply assisted the processing. He checked his phone again. The Social Security transfer he'd been anticipating, the rerouting of Robert's estate assets through the probate structure that Julian's attorneys had prepared 18 months ago. Long before Robert's condition had entered its terminal phase, was scheduled to complete its preliminary authorization today. Contingent on the finalization of Leo's death certificate and the conclusion of today's proceedings. It was a long document with many sections. Julian had read all of them. He had initialed all of them. He put his phone in his pocket and folded his hands in his lap and waited. Artie was brought in at 9:03. He was wearing the institutional clothing that Cook County provided to remanded defendants, a shirt and slacks that fit him poorly. The shirt too large at the shoulders, the slacks too short. He was 58 years old and had spent 8 days in custody, and it showed in the way he carried himself. Not broken. Artie was too stubborn for broken, but compressed, the way a man looks when he has been putting himself back together each morning by sheer discipline, and the discipline has begun to cost him. His hands, broad and calloused, were folded in front of him as he was directed to the defense table. His attorney, a public defender who had met him twice and had the harried, well-intentioned energy of someone managing 40 cases. In a system not designed to allow 40 cases to be managed well, opened a folder and said something low to him. Artie nodded without looking at her. His eyes moved across the gallery. They found Julian. They stopped there, neither confrontational nor fearful. Just acknowledgement. The look of two men who both knew exactly where they were and why. Julian met his gaze evenly. He allowed himself, briefly, a small adjustment of expression, not quite a smile, something smaller than that. The private satisfaction of a man who has verified that his calculations were correct. He looked away and checked his phone. The judge entered at 9:10. The court officer called the room to order. The procedural language began: the case number, the charges as filed, the statement of the defendant's plea. Artie had pled guilty. The sentence would be delivered without trial, without testimony, without the production of evidence or the cross-examination of witnesses. Julian had ensured this by ensuring the guilty plea, which he had ensured by ensuring that the terms of Artie's mortgage were called in simultaneously with his arrest, which made the prospect of a prolonged legal defense financially non-viable for a man with no assets and no family. The system processed facts. Julian had simply assisted the processing. The prosecutor was speaking. Julian was listening with one ear and thinking with the other part of his mind about the afternoon's board meeting, which he would chair, for the first time, as sole acting CEO of Sterling Tech. Robert's estate having passed its preliminary probate threshold this morning pending. The courtroom door opened. Julian did not turn immediately. Courtroom doors opened. It was a public proceeding. He was listening to the prosecutor. But there was a quality to the gallery's silence that changed to sudden intake. Small but collective, the sound a room makes when something unexpected has entered it. He heard the shift in the prosecutor's cadence, the brief, specific hesitation of a speaker who has been visually distracted. He heard the judge's voice pause. He turned. Leo Sterling was standing in the aisle. He was wearing a thrift store suit that was approximately right for his size, dark navy. Clearly purchased in the last 48 hours, with a white dress shirt that was slightly too large at the collar and a tie that had been knotted by hands that had done their best. Over the suit jacket, he was wearing Artie's green canvas work jacket too large, reaching past his hips, its sleeves pushed up to expose his small hands. He was 8 years old and had been declared dead by a front-page headline 4 days ago, and he stood in the aisle of courtroom 14 at Cook County Courthouse as though he had a right to be there, which he did, because the HR director had arranged it. His eyes went to Artie first. Artie's face compressed, disciplined, holding itself together through sheer 30-year habit. Did something that no amount of discipline could have prevented. It opened, not dramatically, just opened, the lines of it reorganized. His hands, folded on the table, went still in a different way than they'd been still before. Leo held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned to the projection unit that Rossi had brought in through the side entrance 20 minutes earlier, connected to a laptop on the gallery's side table, which the court officer had been about to challenge, before the HR director had produced the documentation that authorized its presence as evidence in a matter of judicial interest. Leo looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was clear, 8 years old, clear and steady. "My name is Leo Sterling. I'm not dead, and I have something the court needs to see." The courtroom made a sound that was not quite any single thing, not outrage, not relief, not shock alone. It was the sound of a room whose expectations have been structurally revised in real time. The video played on the courtroom wall. Julian Sterling in the East Wing hallway, infrared lit, 11:47 p.m., Tuesday. His robe, his deliberate 47 seconds. The oxygen concentrator's light going dark. The timestamp in the corner. His face, briefly visible as he turned to leave, caught clearly in the right edge of the frame, the diamond watch glinting once before he moved out of shot. The courtroom watched in silence. Julian was on his feet by the 3rd second. He was moving toward the aisle by the 15th. He had calculated many things over many months, had run the variables with the cold precision of a man who trusted his own processing. He had not calculated this. He had not calculated an 8-year-old in a dead man's jacket, because dead men's jackets were in landfills, and dead boys did not walk into courtrooms. And some variables simply did not appear on any spreadsheet he had constructed. He reached the aisle and a court officer stepped into his path with the specific, unhurried authority of someone whose job required them to occasionally prevent people from leaving rooms at speed. "Sir," the officer said. Julian's attorneys were speaking rapidly into phones. The gallery had erupted. The judge was calling for order with the controlled urgency of a person who understood that what was happening in their courtroom would be on every news broadcast in the country by noon. The handcuffs went on Julian Sterling at 9:27 in the morning, in the aisle of courtroom 14, while his brother's employee sat at the defense table and watched with hands that had finally, stopped having to hold themselves together. Leo stood in the aisle and watched Julian be led toward the side door by 2 court officers, and Julian passed within 3 feet of him, and for a moment their eyes met. The uncle and the nephew, the calculator and the calculated against, and Leo did not look away. Julian did. He was taken through the door. It closed behind him. Leo walked to the defense table and stood beside Artie, and Artie put one large, calloused hand on Leo's shoulder, the shoulder of a boy wearing his jacket, and the courtroom was still calling itself back to order around them. Today, the court wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence. The sign went up on a Thursday in early March, 6 months after the day at the courthouse. It was hand-painted, because Artie had wanted it. Hand-painted, he'd said, in the brief discussion about the matter, that a sign you made yourself meant something a printed sign didn't. And that he'd spent 30 years driving cars with logos on them that belonged to someone else, and he was not going to start over with a sign that came out of a box. The painter was a retired man from the neighborhood who'd done sign work for 50 years and whose opinion of the job's difficulty was conveyed entirely through the pitch of his humming while he worked. He painted in dark green paint on a pale wood board, the letters solid and clean. Miller & Son, Auto Repair and Service, Est. 2025. Leo stood on the sidewalk in front of the shop and looked up at it. The building was a former service station on East 130th, 3 blocks from Rossi's yard, which Iron Mike had effectively underwritten through a combination of a lease arrangement structured as a long-term favor and the quiet provision of tools, lifts, and initial parts inventory from his own salvage stock. Mike had explained this as the closing of a 22-year-old debt, and Artie had argued that it didn't count as closing the debt because the original debt had never been formally acknowledged. And Mike had told him that was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard from a man who was otherwise not dumb, and they had argued about this with the specific comfortable velocity of two people who had been arguing about the same thing for a long time and no longer needed to resolve it. The shop had 2 bays and a small waiting area with 4 chairs and a coffee machine that Artie had found at an estate sale and repaired himself over 2 evenings, with parts from a bin in the back of the yard. The coffee machine worked. The chairs were mismatched. The floor was clean concrete. The whole space smelled of oil and metal and the specific warmth of an enclosed space with a space heater working hard in March, and to Leo it smelled like the Sterling garage in summer. Except that it was theirs, which made it smell completely different in every way that mattered. He was wearing his own jacket now. A child's jacket, brown canvas, purchased at a thrift store with money that Artie had given him for that specific purpose and no other. He'd considered keeping Artie's jacket as his permanent property, but Artie had taken it back gently, without argument, and hung it on a hook inside the shop's back office door, where it remained. It was not a decoration. It was not a museum piece. It was simply the jacket, on its hook, available if needed. Leo thought about it sometimes. He thought about the hidden pocket, now empty. He thought about what Artie had sewn into it with hands not built for the work, in a security booth in the rain, while a man he'd served for 30 years was dying down the hall. The legal proceedings had been extensive and not yet fully concluded. Julian Sterling had been charged with first-degree murder, investment fraud, 401k misappropriation, affecting over 300 Sterling Tech employees, and the subordination of a false confession, the last charge. The attorneys had explained, being the one that carried the weight Julian's team had least anticipated. Because it turned out that pressuring a man into confessing to a crime by calling his mortgage through a proxy company 18 hours after his arrest was, in the state of Illinois, a serious crime in its own right, and one that the prosecutors had pursued with the specific enthusiasm of people who had been handed an unusually clear case. Artie had been released on the 3rd day after the courthouse, his confession vacated, the charges against him dismissed. He had walked out of Cook County Jail wearing a shirt that wasn't his, handed to him by a courthouse paralegal, and Leo had been waiting on the sidewalk in front of the building in his thrift store suit and Artie's jacket and the rubber boots that were still too large. And Artie had come through the door and stopped when he saw him, and they had stood on the sidewalk in the cold for a long moment without speaking. Then Artie had said, "Your boots are too big." "I know," Leo said. "We'll fix that." They had fixed that, and other things, in the months since. Leo was enrolled in a local school 4 blocks from the temporary apartment that Artie had rented, small, ground floor, with a kitchen that needed a new faucet and windows that needed weather stripping, and which Artie was addressing room by room in the evenings with the same methodical patience he brought to engines. Leo had a desk. He had a bed. He had an alarm clock that he was responsible for setting himself, which was a rule Artie had established and not negotiated. He had enrollment papers. The school had required a guardian's signature, and Artie had signed them his full name, Arthur R. Miller, in the signature line that said guardian parent, in handwriting that had gone careful and deliberate at that particular line. As though the letters required more consideration than usual, Leo had watched him sign and had not said anything, because some moments were better observed than commented on. The Sterling Tech Board, under pressure from the shareholder group that the HR director had quietly organized in the 48 hours between Leo's phone call and the courthouse appearance, had placed Robert Sterling's estate in a protected trust pending Leo's majority. Robert had died 10 days after the courthouse quietly, in the hospital, the damage from Julian's Tuesday night visit having progressed without the corrective intervention that proper monitoring would have enabled. The death had been hard. Leo had sat in a hospital chair that was too big for him and held his father's hand, and Artie had sat in the chair across the room and not left until Leo was ready to leave. And when Leo was ready, they had walked out of the hospital together into cold November air and driven back to the apartment in Artie's repaired '08 Civic, and Artie had made soup, and they had eaten it without talking much, and that had been exactly right. The trust would be there when Leo was 18. In the meantime, he was 8 years old and enrolled in school. And living in an apartment with a leaking kitchen faucet and an alarm clock he was responsible for. It was enough. It was, in ways he was still learning to measure, more than enough. They visited Martha on a Tuesday. She was living now in a single-occupancy residence on East Pershing, not the assisted living facility that had sent the eviction notice, a different place, smaller. Independently run, with a director who had come to the profession from social work. And who had met Martha twice and understood that Martha Higgins was not a resident who required management so much as a resident who required space and reasonable peace. The medical debt that had accumulated across 2 years of collection notices had been cleared in a single transaction processed through the Sterling Trust's emergency relief provision, which Leo had asked the trust administrator about specifically, and which the administrator had confirmed was permissible under the trust's charitable designation. And which Leo had then requested be processed, which it was. Martha had been told, over the phone, that the debt was cleared. She had said nothing for several seconds. Then she had said, well, just that. The particular well of a 72-year-old woman who has been navigating systems her entire life and has just encountered the rare moment when one of those systems moved in her favor. They brought her soup on their Tuesday visit, from the diner on the corner. That did a chicken vegetable that Martha had mentioned, once, offhandedly, as the best soup in the neighborhood. She received the soup with the same composed, practical warmth she brought to everything, pouring it from the container into a proper bowl. Because she maintained that soup was not meant to be eaten from a container, and setting 3 places at the small table in her room, and asking Leo about his schoolwork. With the directness of a woman who considered educational progress a matter of ongoing accountability. Leo signed his enrollment papers the following week in the school's front office, the secretary watching as he put his name on the line Leo R. Sterling in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who understood that signatures were not administrative formalities. His hand was steady. Outside the shop, the March wind was cold and direct, and the sign above the door turned at Miller & Son. The painter had gone home. Artie was inside, somewhere in the back, doing something with a belt tensioner that was making a specific tapping sound. The sound was familiar. The sound was regular. It was the sound of a person doing the work in front of them. Leo looked at the sign for another moment, his hands in the pockets of his own jacket, the one that fit him. Then he turned and walked inside, and the door swung closed behind him. And the tapping continued, and the space heater hummed, and somewhere on the hook in the back office, the old green jacket hung in its rightful place. At 58, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure, it's freedom. I signed my own name today. And for the first time, it actually felt like mine. Friends, how did you find today's story? Arthur Miller spent 30 years being the man no one looked at. He held doors. He drove the miles. He watched everything and said nothing, because that was the job, and because he was good at the job, and because for 30 years, being invisible was how he made himself useful. He carried a mortgage he couldn't pay and wore a jacket he couldn't bring himself to throw away, and when the moment came that required everything he had, his savings, his freedom, his name, he gave it all without hesitation. Not for money, not for recognition. For an 8-year-old boy he'd taught to read a dipstick in a summer garage, because that was the kind of man he was. And Leo, 8 years old, declared dead by the morning paper. Sitting in a shipping container in a borrowed rubber boots, in a jacket that reached past his knees. Holding a USB drive that could bring down an empire, choosing to trust the man who had hidden him instead of the world that had written him off. That kind of trust, at that age, in those circumstances, is not a small thing. It's the whole thing. Here's what I keep coming back to. Friends, Artie hid the truth in the trash because he knew a powerful man would never look there. And that's the lesson, isn't it? The people who are certain they've won always stop looking. They stop checking. They trust the gauge and never pull the dipstick. They assume that invisible people stay invisible, that discarded things stay discarded, that a boy declared dead doesn't walk into courtrooms. They are always wrong about this. There are people in your life right now, quiet people, steady people, people who hold doors and drive the miles and see everything and say nothing, who are carrying more than you know. Pay attention to those people. The ones who can't throw away the old jacket. The ones who sew pockets at midnight with hands not built for it. Those are the ones who matter when it counts. And if you've ever felt discarded, if you've ever read your own name in a story that was supposed to be your ending, remember the jacket. Remember that hidden is not the same as lost. And remember that truth is messy, and it's always at the bottom, and it is always worth going looking for. I hope this story brought you something meaningful today. Please subscribe, and hit that like button, it helps more people find stories like this one. We'll see you next time, friends. Take good care of each other.